5 weeks so far. And I've called this week Inventing Gender for a good reason. Because you can't talk about gender without talking about the way that it was invented. So I'm not specifically talking about feminism this week. I'm talking about gender, and I'm talking about how it historically gets either invented or constructed. I'll be using both terms. I've used the word invented in the title because I'm going to be talking quite a lot about science and technology. And I'd like you to think of gender as a technology. It's a technique. It's a means by which bodies are controlled. And remember, we started talking about this with Michel Foucault week before last. So, briefly back to Foucault. Those of you that were here week before last will remember this. Just to remind you, this is Michel Foucault from The History of Sexuality, Part 1, which is his introduction to his multi-volume History of Sexuality that he was partway through when he died. And he's always had, like a lot of these theorists, he's had a bad press in the feminist literature. And I kind of wanted to rescue him. And I think, I remember finding this quote and thinking it's singularly important for feminism. Because what he's doing is he's looking at the 19th century and the way that the sexologists and other scientists started to produce bodies as objects of knowledge. This is a very weird time in history. It's when science turns its lens, turns its microscope, if you like, on who we are. It starts looking at people. It starts to try to identify what it means to be human. And it has a specific method, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, which is how gender really gets produced. So Foucault says, in the process of historisation of women, sex was defined in three ways: as that which belongs in common to men and women, as that which belongs par excellence to men and hence is lacking in women, but at the same time as that which by itself constitutes woman's body, ordering it wholly in terms of the functions of reproduction and keeping it in constant agitation through the effects of that very function. Now, I'm just going to just break that down a bit. First of all, he's in the process of historisation. Hister, if you remember, I said the week before last, is Greek for womb, ancient Greek for womb. Historisation, then, is the reduction of women's bodies to their womb, to their reproductive function. But at the same time, and you'll see, I'm going to be referring to Sigmund Freud later in this lecture, Foucault is pointing out in the same sentence that in the reduction of women's bodies, science says, how do we discover how people are produced? Well, okay, we've got to look at the bodies that harbour people for 9 months of their lives. And they start dissecting women's bodies to understand. And what happens then is that women don't just get hysterised in terms of, oh, okay, their bodies are just walking wombs. We're not just, So that's part of it. We become kind of ambulant wombs. But the other point is that, they want to know, how does this affect women's personalities? How does this affect their behaviour? And then you get the theories of hysteria. So, the theories that say that just because we reproduce, we can be irrational and all the rest of it, and all the other ways that femininity is determined gets hooked onto women's bodies. In this period, towards the end of the 18th and largely during the 19th century, okay, so this is something to bear in mind throughout this lecture, and certainly it's also relevant to the one that I'm going to be doing week after next. Therefore, Foucault can reply to Lady Gaga, no, you're not, you're a product of power relations. This was a meme that was going around a few years ago. I don't know who inaugurated it. It's probably some clever lecturer doing Foucault feminism, playing around on her computer. But it's brilliant, I think, because what it actually says is that, there is nothing about femininity that is natural. Women, you may know that Simone de Beauvoir was the first one to point out that one is not born a woman. One becomes a woman. And as you will see, there are actually even someone like Sigmund Freud could not avoid saying pretty much the same thing. And Foucault is the theorist that says, well, yes, and we become women through the effects of discourse, which is something I spoke about last week, all these bodies of ideas that become kind of second nature to us, that we kind of reproduce whenever we have a conversation. There are assumptions behind everything we say. There's assumptions behind what I'm saying now. I'm making assumptions about you, my audience, and your level of understanding, and the kind of things you'll find acceptable in a lecture. So, you know, unlike last week, I'm not going to talk about unicorns. Well, I just did, but, you know. So there are assumptions that we make. There are ideas that drive the truth of every single thing. With every time we open our mouths, there are certain sets of ideas that drive the truth of what we say, make it acceptable. And what we say, so Lady Gaga, it's quite acceptable to say I was born this way. Everybody cheers and claps. And then Foucault comes along and goes, really? Okay, well, we'll look at it like this. So, I'm going to go back to the 17th century again, and I did refer to this very briefly last week. This is the dawn of liberal humanism. This is when we become human in the way that we understand ourselves now. It's very difficult to get your head around the fact that we haven't always been human. And in actual fact, and I'm hoping I'll have time in the next session to introduce you to my own research, where I argue that actually it's not done as much good being human, and maybe we need to start thinking of ourselves as post-human, but we've got a ways to go to get there. So for the moment, I will use the term human. And remember I said last week that liberal humanism really begins at a point in time when humans, particularly European humans, have started to look beyond the planet. They've started to look beyond their everyday life worlds. And the telescope has been invented, the microscope, so we can see out there, and we can see macro and we can see micro. And this kind of extended vision, this new type of vision, causes all sorts of questions to be asked about what we can know about the world. Prior to that, I don't know that I'm cutting out a lot of history here, and this is kind of shorthand, but like God knew everything. So the mind of God controlled everything, and it was up to us to find out what God was thinking and just kind of get on with it. And then René Descartes comes along and he says, cogito ergo sum, I think, hence I am. And, you know, as I said, he could have said it 10 years earlier and probably would have been laughed at or locked up or something. But he says it just at the right moment, when people are beginning to wonder, what does it mean to be us? And he logically proceeds by logical steps to deduce that our mode of being in the world, what it means to be human, is to think, is to be rational. And that this differentiate, and he thought, you know, animals were like sort of clockwork, that God wound them up in the morning and set them out to be killed by us and eaten. Shiri. So, you know, this is what differentiates, this is what makes us special. We think. It is our job to think, and therefore we have to apply our thought, not only to understanding our world, but to directing our future. Okay? If it is our ontology, if it is our state of being in the world, is to be rational, is to think, then we need to apply these rational minds to finding out all the knowledge, everything we can about the world, and then to apply that knowledge to our own rational improvement. This is what gets kicked off with Descartes. And you know, if you know your philosophy, you'll know that it continues with Immanuel Kant, and that where reason, the idea of reason, gets established. Now, in the process of defining ourselves as thinking things, this is what happens. Remember, in the very first class of this lecture series, we talked about semiotics and how meaning is made and how meaning is produced negatively through binary oppositions. And we understand what something is by comparing it to all the things that it isn't. Okay, there are no positive meanings. They're all negative, and they're compared to a huge range of things that they're not. And we can understand liberal humanism through these binary oppositions, that reason, which is the most important attribute of humans in liberal humanism, of course has its opposite, unreason, because if you're going to spot a human, if you want to know what a human is, then you have to find its opposite somewhere to differentiate it. So, actually, conceivably, if a horse spoke to you and exhibited intelligence and reason, then you think, fair enough, okay, it's human, right? Because you're going to compare it to all the other horses that are just neighing at you, and they're unreasonable. Along with that, you get a division into culture and nature. Now, again, name-dropping philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, among others. But nature has to be defined because it's nature, the natural world, which we need to turn our reason to in order to understand how it works. And the results of that knowledge, what we produce, what is generally called man-made, is culture. It's everything else. It's opposed to nature. And the oppositions get very wide apart sometimes. Nature becomes something out there that either that is weird and mysterious and you don't want to go near, or that we need desperately. And if we don't, because all these oppositions are full of contradictions. You get a lot of writing about the fact that humans need nature, need it desperately. And of course we kid ourselves that we know nature when we see it. So that tree that gets planted in Canary Wharf, because someone's said in the plans that we need some nature around, you think that's nature. Well, no, it's not. It's a tree that's planted in Canary Wharf. And the rest of what we think of as nature actually isn't. Most of it is cultivated land, owned by somebody, planned by somebody. So what is nature? Well, it gets more and more difficult to define. But nevertheless, we carry around this constant opposition between nature and culture. But it's much more complicated than we think. The intellect then gets opposed to the instinct, and of course, finally, the white European imperial man, the conqueror, the colonizer, the owner of most of the planet, gets opposed to women, and as we saw last week in great detail, racial others. Okay? And all the things associated with the intellect, with reason, with culture, and with the white European male is associated with the mind, which is, of course, what René Descartes had decided we are. And everything else gets associated with the body, which from that point on becomes incredibly embarrassing. Because if it's our job to think, if it is our being in the world that we are reasonable, that we apply our reason to understanding the world, then what are we doing with these unreasonable, unruly bodies that, fart and shit and piss and, desire things and get sick and die? So it becomes, you see through the development of culture, through the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, a massive fear of the body emerges. If you want some reading about this, there's a guy called Sigmund Freud, who unfortunately is dead now. I can't remember the name of the book, but he writes brilliantly about the way that the fear of death produces all sorts of other micro fears, so that we are constantly kept in awe of our bodies and constantly monitoring our bodies. Of course, there we are, back to Foucault, who talked about panopticism, self-management, and how we assume there's someone looking at us all the time. So we have to keep making sure that we're behaving correctly, that our bodies are in control. And the control of the body is what we understand as civilization. And a lot of our culture is developed on the basis of controlling the nasty, unruly body that stops us from, thinking clearly, supposedly. I mean, of course, what we now know, and I hope you know, is that we are bodies. We don't have a body. It's weird to say you have a body. That's because it's entered into language. It's part of the discourse. You say, oh, yeah, you know, I have a body or my body, as if there's somehow, you know, there's a you that stands outside and possesses this body. It's much more accurate to say I am a body, because bodies and minds are not separate, but we have the discourse of liberal humanism has such a hold on us that we walk around thinking they are. Okay? So, taking a little bit of a leap, but not too much of one, this is modern science. Modern science develops out of this idea that it is our job to gain knowledge about the world, that we are thinking things, that thinking is what we do, and therefore it's our job to think about the world, to gain knowledge of the world and apply that knowledge. And so you get a massive development of sciences during the 17th and 18th centuries, and even more so during the 19th century. So what is modern science? Okay, so it's a systematic, practical inquiry under the rule of the intellect. So it's very controlled, and it's, you know, to a certain extent it still is. I mean, scientists still at least attempt to follow the rules laid down in the 17th century for the systematic inquiry into what we call the natural world, into what is out there, what exists in the world, and understanding it on a micro level and also on a macro level. It's supposedly an objective observation, a dispassionate analysis. You know, the idea is that when a scientist goes into work and puts on her white coat, basically, you know, the fact that she that, you know, her period's just started, she's got a hangover, the kids were playing up this morning, you know, her political party is not doing too well, and she's got problems with the ex-husband, whatever, okay? All that stuff is supposed to disappear with the white coat. It's supposed to be, you know, we are supposed to be completely dispassionate and able to function rationally without reference either to our bodies or to anything else that's happening around us. This is what's the idea of scientific analysis is, that there is a pure intellect that we can have access to. And that Britain really gets in on the act. Although most of the philosophers, up until the development of, you know, when modern science really gets going, most of the philosophers are French and German. Then you get a load of Brits. And the Royal Society, which was founded in 1660, was founded in this country. And its motto still is, nullius in verba, means take nobody's word for it. Or it means literally nothing in words. But what it actually implies is, don't take anybody's word for it. So this is why supposedly, and, you know, I say this advisedly because scientists know that this doesn't always happen as it should, that a scientist, you know, in quotes, proves something, and, you know, the other scientists say, yeah, okay, that's all very well, but then it has to go through peer review, and that experiment, which supposedly proves something, has to be replicated by another group of scientists, or it is not valid. That's the general idea. And the world of objects was to be scrutinised, studied, catalogued, and classified. Objects, okay? What are objects? Well, objects are not just things in the world, not just material things, but anything that you direct your attention to as a scientist, so anything that is worthy of study. And there's another binary opposition here, which is incredibly important, because it is the subject that studies the object. And I will be returning to this, but if you've heard the term objectification, particularly in relation to women's bodies, it doesn't just mean that we are made into objects for men to do whatever they want with, or whatever that definition you'll work with. It is founded in this idea that the woman's body is an object for this to be studied by the neoliberals, the liberal humanist subject. The liberal humanist subject is the male scientist, okay, who studies the objects in the world. So all the objects are anything you turn your attention to, and the woman's body is one of those objects. So nature was to be controlled. This became the object of modern science, that nature, which is a whole collection of objects out there in the world, was to be understood in order that it could come under the control of humans. Okay, everybody all right so far? Okay. So now, here's a load of Brits. This is from, actually I've got all these from a book called Science and Sexual Oppression by a guy called Brian Easley. It's brilliant. He studies all these guys from the 17th and 18th centuries, and read all their writings about the scientific project, and look at it. Calls it the penetrative metaphor. It's brilliant. Look at it. So Isaac Barrow wants to search nature out of her concealments and unfold her dark mysteries. Francis Bacon reckons that men should unite forces against the nature of things, storm and occupy her castles and strongholds. Okay. Thomas Spratt, he's a bit wordy, this guy. He says, whoever will make a right and a fortunate courtship to nature, he cannot enterprise or attempt too much. For she, as it is said of other mistresses, is also a mistress that soonest yields to the forward and the bold. Okay, so nature's to be raped. And finally, Henry Oldenburg, he just comes right out and says it. Scientists should penetrate from nature's antechamber to her inner closet. And there's tons of this that goes on, okay? So nature becomes identified with the woman's body. Okay, so all the objects out there become identified as female and as able to be penetrated. Okay, so this is an exercise for you. I will read this to you. Basically, I read the whole of The Descent of Man. I read The Origin of Species is brilliant, by the way. Charles Darwin, I've got nothing against him. It is a brilliant piece of work, The Origin of Species. Descent of Man, not so much. Because he tries to apply the theory of evolution to people, and he can't escape the assumptions of the time in which he was writing. He cannot escape the discourses that construct his ideas of what people are. Now, I'll just read this through with you. He's talking about women, obviously. He says, the chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown, that's old-fashioned spelling, not me, by man's attaining a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman. If two lists were made of the most eminent men and women in poetry, painting, sculpture, music, history, science and philosophy, with half a dozen names under each subject, the two lists would not bear comparison. We must also infer that if men are capable of a decided preeminence over women in many subjects, the average of mental power in man must be above that of woman. Okay. Now this becomes scientific fact because Darwin's got clout. So I'm going to ask you what's wrong with it. Now, aside from the obvious, it's obviously wrong, okay? That's one of the things that's wrong with it. But having said what I've said about science, okay, I talked to you about the scientific method, this dispassionate observation, etc. Tell me what's wrong with this scientifically. Give you a few minutes to think about it. Please talk to each other if you want to.
He doesn't define what he means by their comparison, and he doesn't provide any evidence.
No, that's true. He doesn't provide any, but he does have his lists. That's his evidence as far as he's concerned.
What list? Just the... not in this quote.
No, he's made some lists. Well, he's yeah.
Big list of people.
Yeah, yeah. This is his evidence that if you make a list of all the men under, I don't know, history, and then the women under history, that the man's list will be longer.
Oh, okay.
That's
but it says something about half a dozen, with half a dozen names under each subject. So I thought it was the same length.
Oh, yeah, no, actually, yes, he's being a bit obscure there, isn't he? Yeah.
Because I was thinking, if it's the same length, then he's literally talking about, like, the quality, and he doesn't qualify what that is.
No, he doesn't. That's true. Have some more ideas? No? Nobody else? Yes.
It's like, I agree that he doesn't define any of the terms, like that's what we picked up on as well, the 6 names, yeah. So he's not using that, he's not even using any evidence that someone could take based on what you said about.
Yeah, okay. But there's some evidence that's missing. What's he missing? Yes.
To me, it's a data point of education at the time. And so if you looked at that, which he would have been very well aware of, that women were not allowed into the main universities, not allowed into schools, they weren't funding female education at the time.
Yeah. So here we start coming to the crux of the problem, isn't it? That, what is he saying? That when we know damn well that women were barred from most of the universities, certainly barred from progressing in certain ways, that women's education was very poor. What else?
Yes.
He's choosing categories that are only filled by men because of the social structures of what is prized.
Yeah.
He's not making a list of who is the best in all of these categories at raising children or giving birth.
Thank you. Exactly. Even though the theory of evolution is really all about giving birth. Okay? He misses out the fact that, and if it's true, his lists that, the shorter list that, the women's list being shorter than the men's, that may well be the case in his time because, as you've pointed out, women were less well educated. They were also, there was no contraception. They were taking care of the children. So they wouldn't have had time, although some of them did, of course. Some of them did have time to engage in, and you'll see actually in the next session, I've got a woman from the 16th century who seemed to have plenty of time to engage in philosophy. So he's not taking into account the social structures that are impacting women's ability to excel in these areas. And as you very rightly pointed out, he makes a list of things that, are valued, are culturally valued. So therefore, child rearing and homekeeping, which was, of course, something that middle class women, were very much involved in, and it was considered a very important part of their function. This is not considered something of value and therefore not even worth mentioning. Okay, so that's Darwin. I'm going to move on now to somebody else who had a massive influence an even bigger influence, in fact, on how we understand gender, and that's Sigmund Freud. Okay, now psychoanalysis is phenomenally important to how we understand ourselves, in particular how we understand ourselves as sexual and sexed. So very, very important to how we understand our bodies and how they function and how we understand desire and how we act out our desire. Freudian discourse is, however you may want to diss Sigmund Freud, and lots of people do, but unfortunately every time you open your mouth to talk about your sexuality, you are using Freudian discourse. Okay, he was that important. Now, he obviously got dissed by feminists and still does, but part of the debate about psychoanalysis is about whether it's a science or an art. As a science, it's flawed, and I'm not going to go there. There's a book that you might find interesting by a feminist writer of the late 1960s called Juliet Mitchell, It's called Psychoanalysis and Feminism. And she writes a defense of Freud, which is very interesting. I think other feminists have picked her up and run with it. And basically, if you understand psychoanalysis as an art, if you understand him to be writing a kind of fiction or a poetry, a poetics of how we are socialized, then he becomes incredibly interesting. And I have to say that you cannot escape psychoanalysis if you're going to read feminist theory. Because Jacques Lacan, who we met in my lecture 4 weeks ago, develops Freudian ideas in such a way that he enables people like very famous feminists like Judith Butler and Laura Mulvey to put forward a theory of gender, which is still a part of feminist discourse now. And I hear their ideas in the discourse around the Me Too and the Time's Up and all the other feminist movements that have begun in the 21st century. So we need to understand Freud in order to understand them. On the other hand, I will say that there are certain things that Freud didn't get. He certainly didn't get women. He admitted that. And his theories about the way that girl children develop is quite bizarre, as you'll see in a minute. Although, again, in his defence, he just published everything he thought. You're not allowed to do that these days. Whatever Freud thought, he wrote down and he published it. And he keeps saying things like, "Oh, I think I might have got it wrong. Try this for size," you know. So I'm going to give you a very potted, very, because people go to university for several years to study psychoanalysis. And I've taught whole modules on it. So this is like 10 minutes on psychoanalysis. So forgive me if there are gaps. So psychoanalysis is a body of ideas. It can be understood as a philosophy and a description of the development of the personality in a particular cultural context. This is my definition of psychoanalysis for the purposes of this lecture. As well as also, you will know, a clinical practice. And again, those people that diss psychoanalysis, loads of people have psychoanalysis now. And if you've had any form of counselling, there would not be counselling if there hadn't been psychoanalysis. It's all based on this kind of on this idea of a therapy that can enable you to adjust yourself to your social situation. Of course, you may not want to adjust yourself to your social situation. And this is one of the things that psychoanalysis faces us with. That, if you are unhappy in your social situation, maybe that's a structural problem. Maybe it's systemic. Maybe there's a problem with the social structures in which you live that make you unhappy. And why do you need, perhaps there's a better way of dealing with that than going to a psychoanalyst and getting yourself fixed. But that's just something to bear in mind. Psychoanalysis is primarily concerned with desire and its role in childhood development. It's not, in the early part of Freud, it's not sexual desire, strictly speaking. It's libido, which is not, strictly speaking, sexual desire. It simply describes the fact that baby gets born. Baby, unless it's suffering from depression straight out of the womb, has a lust for life. Has to, or it would die. Okay? This is desire. It needs to live. And babies for Freud, and I'm not a mother, but I presume that anybody that is will know that babies are a bundle of desire. They want. Okay? They haven't learned to control themselves yet. The very reason that they scream is they're desperate for something and they don't know what actually, they haven't done semiotics. Okay? They don't know what it is. They can't identify what they want. They just want. And they get satisfied. Their wants get satisfied, first and foremost, says Freud, by mother. Well, that makes sense as well. I'm not going to go into, whether it's the breast or the bottle. And also now, of course, many babies get satisfied by dad, which is great. But we have to assume, for my shortened version of psychoanalysis, that it's the breast, okay? What they get is mother's breast, full of milk, and they feel for a moment that desire is satisfied. Everything's okay, they can go to sleep, they're happy, they can start looking at the world and they can start learning stuff once they have that desire satisfied. So breasts are really, really important to babies. So, psychoanalysis is based on an analysis of the relationship between the child and its parents or carers from birth onwards. So it is that relationship which begins with the mother, and so we have to assume the mother, satisfying the child's very first desire that it cannot yet even name. I'm going to jump over a whole load of ideas here to the point where to punishment, where the child starts to get socialised, because this is what it's about, what being a parent is about. You may think it's about all sorts of things, but actually what it's fundamentally about is civilising children, making sure that they are civilised, and civilised in the way determined by the power relations in which they are growing up. Okay? So they have to learn to be good people. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. They have to learn to be good gendered people. And this is what the job of parents really is. And this is what Freud says quite clearly. So the parents, particularly the father, and at the time that Freud was writing, you can imagine a typical middle-class family. And, you know, the mother says, or the nursemaid says, you wait till your father gets home, you know, he'll deal with you. And so you've got this fear of the father that is the source of authority and that metes out punishment. And one of the ways that children are punished, of course, is they're deprived of things. Now, this is where it got very weird. Actually, Freud was really brave. I mean, he went to the US in, I think it's 1925. And they welcomed him, and he wrote to one of his mates, and he said, this is just wrong. He said, I expect to actually be treated with a certain amount of contempt because of some things I say, but that they'd already got the idea in the United States that actually you could use this technique to make people behave, which is why psychoanalysis is so massive in the States. And so they said, well, welcome, Dr. Freud, you know, we love this. There was some more suspicion of him in this country because he said, and one of the things he said was that children masturbate. Oh, my God. You know, little boys play with their dicks. And, of course, you know, little boys don't masturbate to orgasm, but they get a great deal of pleasure from their own bodies. Now, you can understand this, and, you know, it sounds mad, but what Freud says is, you know, the main object of desire is the mother's breast. And the trouble is with the breast, it keeps going away. That, you know, you get fed, you feel good, and then you've got to start screaming all over again because it's disappeared. And sometimes it doesn't come back for ages. And you get all these theories of child rearing throughout the ages. Sometime in the 20th century, it was decided you had to let children scream for as long as possible, thus traumatising them. So, you know, that when it comes back, the relief is enormous. But the child is, at this point, is learning about the idea of control. If only I could control this thing that satisfies all my desires, that keeps pissing off, okay? So it's you know, it's pretty traumatic being a child. So you've got dad punishing it, taking things away. Oh my God, what if dad takes away the things that I have pleasure in? First of all, the breast. Well, dad apparently keeps taking the breast away. But what if he took my penis? Thinks the little boy. I know. At this point, the child is learning that someone in the household hasn't got one. And assumes, according to Freud, that person or people, because if it, the child has a younger sister, lost theirs because they misbehaved. So the theory goes, okay, that the father possesses the fully grown penis. I mean, at some point, you have to assume that the child sees the parents naked or something. I mean, I guess, we all learn about it, so presumably we did. So, you see what's happening here, that the child, to behave himself, this is the boy child, must learn to be like the father, otherwise he's going to lose his dick. This is the castration complex, yeah? And he's now ready to learn to conform to cultural prohibitions. He's now ready to learn to be a good masculine man, to behave just like dad, so that his penis is safe, right? The most important thing to him. But, big but, says Freud, the mother is the first love object, because she was the first object that satisfied the child's desire, okay? And is, the child has learned by this point, possessed by the father. Hence the Oedipus complex, which you probably all know something about. So what has to happen? Oh, yeah. This gets resolved by the fact that the boy child says to himself, oh, okay, I can have one of my own. I can't have mum because she belongs to dad. But if I grow up and my penis gets as big as dad's, which it never will, because the child's view of the father's penis is like this massive, dick pics. I mean, one of my colleagues said that she's going to make a collage of all the dick pics she's got through Tinder. This is true, it just seems to prove something, boys, sorry, but it really does. So that, marriage then becomes, absolutely necessary for the boy to grow up and feel like a proper man, to possess this object that he so desires and he's also scared of because, it kept going away. Okay? So this is Freudian psychoanalysis, and it does seem to make a fair amount of sense, yes? Yeah? Okay, on to girls then. Okay, this is where he admitted he was struggling. Apparently little girls at some point give up masturbation because they see that boys have more genitals than they do. Yeah. And we apparently associate the male genital with greater pleasure, so we have to stop, because what's the point? And we apparently learn about pregnancy, which we understand to be a gift from the father. Yep. And associate the penis with the gift. So, and apparently then our appetite for sexual pleasure is reawakened by this developing desire for the gift. And of course, in the 19th century, nobody thought lesbians existed. So, the gift is defining of female sexuality. So, for Freud, what Freud does is he does a Darwin. Darwin's lists and Freud's female sexuality are pretty much of the same order. He just decides that female sexuality is passive. We wait around for the gift to be given to us. We are never active. Yeah. But, and it's dead funny, but at the same time, this is how femininity gets defined, and it gets acted out. Because this is very powerful discourse. He's at the time considered to be a scientist. As I say, now there's been a debate that I think it's died down a bit now. There was a time in the 20th century when massive debate about whether psychoanalysis was a science or an art. And if you think of it as an art, it does, if you think of it as poetic, as somehow a metaphor for social development, then it does kind of make sense. As science, it's flawed in all sorts of ways, particularly, as I say, his observations of girl children. Okay, so this is how gender gets invented. Okay, just one more slide, then we'll have a break. So this is kind of, I mean, you could find lots more oppositions here, but just sort of this is the most obvious ones. So you get, femininity on the one side, masculinity on the other. Femininity, as I've said, Freud seems to prove is passive, therefore masculinity is active. Femininity is associated with being an object, so being an object of scientific study, also, the object of the male, what the male pursues, whereas the masculinity is all about being the self-possessed subject. The femininity is to be possessed, and masculinity is self-possessed. Femininity weak, masculinity strong, I think that's screamingly obvious. Femininity private, and masculinity public. I mean, this is also associated with the genitals. So women's genitals are thought of as sort of private and concealed, and so you get all these scientists wanting to, pursue her to her hiding places. But also femininity gets associated with the private realm. And masculinity, particularly during the 19th century, with the public realm. So the man is the one that goes out there into the public realm, makes the money, the breadwinner, all this kind of stuff. Whereas the woman is not only a private possession. So you can see how woman gets conflated as an object with private property. The wife is private property, and she lives in the private domestic realm. Whereas the man goes out into the public realm and, does politics and stuff. Now, conversely and weirdly, femininity then gets associated with morality and masculinity with corruption. It's the woman's job as a good domestic goddess to look after the men's morals, because the world of culture is corrupt. The world of business and politics is corrupt. It's understood that men need to be closer to nature. And this is all this sort of myth of nature that you need to be cleansed by having a relationship with nature. And the closest you can get in the cities of the 19th century is to go home to the wife, who will look after your morals, your moral well-being. And young men are supposed to be, who don't get married are not only suspected of being gay, but also suspected of being somehow corrupt and somehow morally corrupt, because they don't have a good woman to guide them. Femininity with poverty and masculinity with wealth, well, that's screamingly obvious because it's true. And femininity with cowardice and masculinity with bravery. I'm not sure cowardice is the right word there, actually. But in need of protection. And the masculinity is what is protective. Is what a woman requires to be. And there's one of my favourite feminists, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was an American who wrote in the early 20th century. She writes in her autobiography about being at a party and a man wanting to walk her home, and she says no, and he says, well, I don't understand you. Man is woman's natural protector. And she said, yeah, weird that. What is it you're protecting me from? Oh, yeah, other men. So, and this is, very early 20th century, and that has echoes right now, in Me Too. Anyway, so time to order pizza or whatever. 10 minutes. See you back here. Oops, my mic just died. So we've kind of got to the point where we've defined masculinity and femininity, and we've kind of understood how gender is invented. But what we need to now look at is how it's enacted and its relationship to economics. I'm going to talk more about this week after next, but for now, last week I introduced you very briefly to the theories of Pierre Bourdieu and the idea of cultural capital. I've got rather a long quote from him here, which I'm just going to kind of break down. Cultural capital essentially is about, it's largely about social class. He was a sociologist, and he did massive studies among middle class people in France. And defined class in ways where you could understand how people distinguish themselves largely by how they use their bodies, by what they do with their bodies, by what they put on their bodies, so the kind of clothes they wear, and the kind of what he calls habitus, this expression of subjectivity in the public realm is what I've called it. Subjectivity is what we're talking about here. This is. Remember, we talked about subject positions in Foucault. How you occupy a subject position, so that discourse produces these subject positions that you can occupy at different times in your life, and depending on your social status. And this is kind of where Bourdieu is coming from, but what he's more interested in is how we express our subjectivity, how we express the subject position that we occupy through our behaviour and through the way that we style ourselves. So this is all about, really about taste. And so, of course, it's about consumption. It's about the stuff we buy in order to express who we think we are. So he says the primary forms of classification owe their specific efficacy to the fact that they function below the level of consciousness and language, beyond the reach of introspective scrutiny or control by the will. So, it's like something you can't help. So in the process of being socialized, in the process of growing into a civilization, growing into a civilized person in any specific culture, you inculcate, you absorb these ideas, which you then act out. And then what you're doing then is perpetuating a discourse. Remember when I talked about Michel Foucault and I said we all perpetuate discourse whether we like it or not. We produce truth constantly simply by acquiescing to statements, to certain statements, and acting surprised when we hear others. Really is something as simple as that. So this idea of these aspects of our behaviour being beyond the reach of introspective scrutiny or controlled by the will. In other words, they are part of an other aspect of ourselves that we carry around with us and that we exchange constantly. So there's a constant process of exchange whereby we tell people who we are simply by standing there and wearing particular clothes, having a particular accent. And I think Bourdieu says somewhere in that quote, the way you blow your nose. See, I hope I included that bit because I like it. Yes, he says orienting practices practically they embed what would mistakenly called values in the most automatic gestures or the apparently most significant techniques of the body, ways of walking or blowing one's nose, ways of eating or talking, and engage in the most fundamental principles of construction and evaluation of the social world, those which most directly express the division of labour, so between classes, the age group and the sexes, or the division of the work of domination in divisions between bodies and between blah, 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 blah. Ending with, as if to give them the appearance of naturalness. Okay? So masculinity, femininity, not to mention race and social class, are things that we act out constantly. But masculinity and femininity, and I think you could actually put this together with Freud and say because they are inculcated into us at a very, very young age, is something that you kind of can't help. It's something that you perpetuate simply by the way that you act, or the way in which you act against your apparent gender. We haven't yet spoken about the relationship between gender and biological sex, which I will talk about more next week. But, Freud, of course, throws up the problem that he only talks about two genders. And he is writing in a period of time when that panic that I talked about last week about reproduction and about reproducing the master race, so us, basically, white Europeans, produce not only sexology, so there's this huge rise in the science of sexuality, but also concern about biological sex, to the extent that, you know, babies were born that were somewhat indeterminate, but a determination was made by doctors as to which biological sex that child would grow up in, because they obviously they couldn't entertain the idea of somebody being not specifically sexed. There's a really, again, a fascinating writer called Anne Fausto Sterling. She's written several books about this from the medical point of view, the way that most babies that are born are not specifically sexed. In many, many ways, and it's not just that, you know, you look at the genitals and you say, oh, that's a boy and that's a girl, that actually genetically we cannot be determined to be one biological sex or the other, mostly. So I won't go into it because it's very complicated, but she's really worth reading because she writes in a very straightforward way. And she throws doubt on even on the idea of biological sex, let alone gender. So, okay, so we've got this idea of distinction, we've got this idea of cultural capital. Cultural capital is having the right movements, wearing the right clothes, having the right moves, using the right language, having the right accent, having the right deportment for a specific social class and or gender gender associated with a social class, okay? Because as we all know, that people of different social classes act their gender differently. What I want to do is another exercise now. So this is for you. I want you to think about masculinity and femininity expressed as cultural capital. Think about, first of all, the easiest way to start is, what does it mean to be a middle class feminine or masculine person? How would you demonstrate your, a good or a high or a well-determined cultural capital? So a cultural capital associated with a certain amount of wealth and a certain amount of education. Think about that, and then think about other social classes and how the demonstration of cultural capital is enacted on the body. Okay? So I'll give you 10 minutes. Somebody just showed me a news article from about this time last month, which says that the Trump administration is considering forcing people to choose one binary gender, and that if you're unsure, then you can have a genetic test, which is, absolutely shows the connection with the necessity for a gender binary and fascism. For an absolute certainty about not only gender roles, but about the reproduction of what's considered to be the master race. And I was hoping my friend Dan would be here tonight, actually. I had a feeling he might not make it. He's an expert in this, and he can tell you that gender is not... you cannot determine gender through a genetic test. Because there are too many variables. As I say, Anne Fausto Sterling is the one that writes about it. My friend Dan can actually talk about it. And unfortunately, he didn't come because I think it would have been perfect if he'd been here. Never mind. Anyway, so back to the exercise. So cultural capital and masculinity and femininity. What did you come up with? Yes, back there.
For femininity, we came up with wearing bras,
Yeah.
and not being too outspoken.
Yeah, that's a good one. Not being too outspoken, yeah.
Have a slim figure and not a big appetite.
Yeah. So, that's a really good one. Not have a big appetite. It's all about not having too much desire.
For
Yes.
everything.
Yeah, for everything. Yeah.
And aspire to be a bride and become a mother.
Yeah, aspire to be a bride, which is still true, sadly. Yeah. Okay, let's have some more. Yes.
We didn't actually talk about this, but I think there's a big, like, realism thing in masculinity. Like, men often sort of, you know, criticize one another if they say something that's, like, sort of very imaginative, say. But I think it takes different forms depending on whether you're sort of, like, depending on class you are. But I think there is definitely a sort of, like, I don't know if that goes back to the mind-body distinction you made about the idea that you should be very rational, like, realistic.
Yeah. So no unicorns in male discourse.
Exactly.
Masculine, okay. Yeah, that's a good one actually. So you have to display rationality constantly. You can't be too imaginative in your everyday conversation. Yeah, good one. Let's have some more. Yes.
Yeah, that being well behaved. So not like being too loud or too interesting, but just the right amount of
For women, for feminine persons. Yes. So being well behaved, like, yes, actually keeping yourself under control. So femininity is more about control. Yeah, I'll go with that. Yeah. More?
We said so when going to spas for women and then going to like sporting events for masculinity.
Oh, yeah. That femininity has its places and masculinity has its places. This is really important, actually. That there are spaces where you gain gendered cultural capital simply by occupying those spaces, and where you are somehow not quite right, you don't quite fit in other spaces. And I've done some writing about the city and how it is gendered, actually how cities are constructed in terms of race and gender. And it's really interesting that it's not, the assumption is made that feminine persons shouldn't be in certain parts of the city because it's dangerous for them. It's actually, that's really not the case, although of course it is dangerous for everybody in various parts of the city, supposedly. Actually, we police ourselves as to which spaces in the city we occupy, and I think, that's an interesting one. That going to sporting events is sort of naturally associated with masculinity, and going to, did you say spas?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or shopping. Yeah. Okay. Shiri.
I just want to actually what you said about the city. I used to work in the city, not as a banker or anything, in a kind of an arts organization, but I was pregnant, and I noticed that people looked at me in disgust. Like, it was so alien, and it was before those badges that you had on the tube, so nobody would like, it was so disgusting for them.
Yeah, that's true.
But, like, in our group, we talked about the kind of the class expression of, like, masculinity, femininity, and about the kind of the number of children that you produce, and how that changed. And I mean, that might be very anecdotal, but from my experience of kind of being around a certain type of like middle class people, at some point, like in the last few years, or maybe like kind of 10, 20 years ago, it kind of changed, and like middle class women produce like shitloads of babies.
Yes.
It's a thing to have 4 children in Little Venice.
Is it really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Because it used to be that you had middle class cultural capital because you only had 2. Or was it 2.4 at one point, wasn't it, in the 20th century?
And now it's a thing to have lots.
And now it's a thing to have lots. Yeah. Yes.
Which is really interesting because there's also the flip side of that, which is like the kind of tabloid news stories shaming women on benefits who have like multiple children. Like, it's kind of the same thing, but
absolutely,
a marker of like 2 different classes.
Yeah, because there are the bodies are differently marked. Yeah. So if your body is marked with the signs of the bourgeoisie, then you can get away with having 4 children. Yeah. But if it isn't, anything else? Yes.
I mean, we mostly talked about like the delivery of language.
Good.
So I was specifically talking about like how, even though I'm ashamed of it, I do change the delivery of. If I'm saying, I might be saying the same thing, but I will change the delivery of the way that I say it if in order to appease certain men in the workplace.
Oh yeah.
And I'll soften my voice,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm very aware that if I was to sort of just say it the way I would say it in any other context, that it might be taken as like a kind of aggressive kind of act, and I feel like that is not, like, wouldn't be the same if a man was to do it that way.
Yeah, so how do we relate that to cultural capital, like femininity and not being aggressive? So how does that establish you as perhaps a middle class feminine person? Is it assumed that working class feminine persons are
Emotionally intelligent.
That's a good way of putting it. Emotionally intelligent, yes.
I was confused a bit about being appropriately subservient, and how like people who are middle class go back to that, like you're well behaved because you can control yourselves, and you, as a woman, you know who to be subservient to because you understand.
Yes, yeah. It's about having particular forms of knowledge. Absolutely brilliant. Yes, it is. And this is something that Bourdieu says quite a lot about. That it's that you are enacting the fact that you have certain knowledges, that you have access to certain knowledges. Yeah. And even if that knowledge is how to be appropriately subservient. Yeah. Okay. I've got a few. I made a brief list last night. Some of these you've actually kind of spread. You know, it's the first thing that occurred to me. That in general, this is general cultural capital of femininity and masculinity. That masculinity is asserts itself through spreading out. And I note that, you know, everybody notices this on the tube, but it still happened. There were two American guys on the DLR yesterday who were big guys, and they were taking up a massive amount of space. And it seemed to me that if I was to spread myself out in order to challenge them, which I actually have done on various occasions, but it's usually sort of teenage boys, and they're easy, they're a pushover. It's just these large Americans that somehow I would be drawing attention to myself that I didn't want. So yeah, manspreading, there's a bit, yeah, that's a massive one. Masculinity is, the cultural capital is associated with technology. I was thinking specifically of cars, but also the knowledge to manipulate technology. And I don't know whether any of you have experienced this, the fact that I'm a bit of a geek and that I actually enjoy computers is for, you know, some people is a little bit shocking. Even in 2018, it's a little bit shocking that I'm like, oh yeah, I can fix that. I know how to do that. Not supposed to. So the accoutrements of masculinity which pertain to cultural capital tend to be associated with technology. I think predominantly cars, but also, of course, now computers. And femininity, I would suggest clothes. You have a kind of knowledge of how to dress. This is you're showing, and I think this is particularly class-based. That there is a particular knowledge of how to appear middle class, how to appear as a middle class feminine person, which accrues you cultural capital, which enables you to establish your cultural capital simply by stepping outside the door, wearing the right pair of trousers with the right pair of shoes. Masculinity is associated, and I think, you know, although cultural capital is about knowledge in general, I think masculinity is associated with knowledge and femininity with beauty. And I'd say the reason for this is because, again, it's about, femininity tends to be about stepping outside the door and establishing your appearance, and then moving into the space, what you were saying earlier about the spaces of masculinity and femininity. Moving into the space, the acceptable space of femininity, having established that your appearance allows you to be there. Whereas I think for the masculine person, it's about displaying knowledge. So being an expert. Feminine persons are not generally thought of as experts. Or expertise is not associated with femininity, but expertise is associated with masculinity. I think a big one then is also associated with that is that masculinity is associated with conversation and femininity with gossip. Because conversation is very much associated with debate. And debate is understood to produce knowledge, whereas feminine conversation is trivialized as gossip that produces nothing, that just maintains the status quo. I don't know about bravery. I'll go, yeah. I don't know the words I was looking for there, so we'll skip that one. I was thinking of femininity and its association with modesty, and that there are different types of modesty. Now, I think we've discussed some of them already, that feminine cultural capital actually turns on being self-possessed, quiet, not drawing too much attention to yourself, and not being an expert. And I think this is still very much true, that if you speak up in mixed company, you're not expected to know anything. And that masculinity is associated with self-promotion, which is conversely, and of course all these things are always contradictory, what we're all supposed to be doing right now. The neoliberal self, the new subject that is produced by advanced capitalism, is supposed to promote the self constantly, so that we're supposed to secure our cultural capital and then go out there and be something that is, people desire. Desire is activated constantly by capitalism, particularly by consumer capitalism. And particularly right now, where it's become extremely obvious that what we are doing is activating desire. This is what we're meant to do with our bodies and with our self-presentation. Desire for us as competent workers. But we are competent workers who conform to our gender roles, even though a lot of the time we try to pretend that we don't. And of course, the big one. Masculinity is associated with sexual experience, and femininity associated with virginity. And I've put it like that because it still is. The reason for that is that we still have the virgin-whore dichotomy in our estimation of degrees of femininity. The self-possessed woman, the quiet woman behaving herself, is assumed to be virginal in some sense. Because if she's not behaving herself, if she's not self-possessed, and if she's outspoken, and if she's, expressing opinions, then she slips into the category of the whore. And this is another one of those binary oppositions that has followed the definition of gender, particularly the definition of female gendered persons, for many centuries. But it gets kind of defined during the 19th century in terms of the science of sexology as a perversion. So for a woman to not be virginal, and to actually express active sexual desire is defined as a perversion, and we still suffer from that. Yes.
Could I suggest? I don't know if this is correct, but suggest that perhaps virginity in the 21st century might be defined as monogamy instead of virginity. I'm not really sure that it's prized in the same way.
Absolutely, and I think this is why I sort of put the word there to make associations with previous definitions of feminine cultural capital. And you're absolutely right that it is, that now the way that it's expressed is the monogamous woman, the woman that doesn't sleep around, the woman that doesn't have multiple partners, And, we still have the words slut and whore, and they're still applied to women. So that there is still the discourse of virginity is still a massive part of the way that femininity is defined. Okay, so good exercise. So moving on. So this is how we might, this is just something to take away for next time. This is what we might call the basis of gender politics. So I know that we've disputed this, but we need to start somewhere. So a good place to start is that we are born male and female, so we may be born not male and female, but we're determined male and female by somebody in the hospital or wherever before we're sent out into the world. But we're gendered masculine and feminine. So the relationship between biological sex, so the way that we biologically appear, and it is largely visual because, as I said, you cannot do a genetic test for maleness and femaleness that's totally accurate. And we're gendered masculine and feminine. Gendering is what takes place as we are socialised. And the way Freud describes the way that we're socialising, at the same time provides the discourse for future socialisations. Psychoanalysis is this weird pivotal thing, which kind of takes on board the way that children were socialised at the time that he was writing. So he's writing from within a very specific culture and describing what happens within that culture. But at the same time, he then gifts us with a discourse, or he gifts the culture with a discourse, which enables the perpetuation of those gender roles that he describes. Very interesting. So the meaning of gender is historical and culturally determined. So gender does not always mean the same thing, has not always meant the same thing throughout the centuries. Right now we're going through a change in how gender is understood, but the old gender roles are still there. The old gender roles are still underpinning. They're a part of the discourse in our redefinition of gender that we're going through at the moment. The social and biological sciences reinforce assumptions about bodies and their appropriate behaviour and abilities. Now, they're still doing it. They're still at it. So, the mere fact that we have sciences that examine who we think we are and examine us on a biological level, on a microbiological level even, perpetuates certain discourses about how bodies should be, because sciences produce incredibly powerful discourses, which, particularly now, I have to say that what they used to call blue sky science, the sort of the idea that you could actually do science because you fancied finding something out is a myth of the past. Because right now, in order to do science, because of the way universities are funded, you've really got to find somebody interested in supporting your science. And very often the person that's going to be doing the funding has a vested interest in a particular outcome. I'm not saying that there is no science done now which is beneficial. I'm not saying that there is no science done now which is independent. But there is a great deal of science done now, and it's mostly what gets into the provides the clickbait on the internet and gets into the tabloid press. It's science that is funded because there is a vested interest in a particular outcome. So the 19th century and the 21st century have a great deal in common in that they have a supposed objective science which is actually producing results that reinforce certain power relations. And finally, there's this, the question that early feminism was grappling with was, does biology imply destiny? So if you're born with a womb, does that mean you have to live in a particular way? And I think we're still trying to answer that question. And week after next, not next week because we're having a break, I'll give a lecture where I'm going to start, where I'm going to introduce some writers that have, helped us to think about that question. Okay, that's it for this week. Thank you very much. Shuri wants to talk to you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to make two really short announcements. This is really short. So this event and all the ones before it and the one after it are part of the Antiuniversity, which I'm sure everyone here knows about. But if not, the Antiuniversity is a program or a project of radical learning and mutual education that takes place in loads of places all over the country and even in other countries. And on the 28th of November, which is in 2 weeks, we're going to have a big meeting to kind of reimagine what the Antiuniversity could be. Should it be a festival like it has been in the last 4 years? Should it be lectures like this? How could people participate? And how can we think collectively about what the Antiuniversity should be? So 28th November in Kentish Town, North London. Join us. It's obviously everything is free. And then just really quickly plugging something else. And if other people have other plugs, just come here. On the subject of feminist discourse and maybe more towards action, the Feminist Anti-Fascist Assembly is regularly meeting, and the next action will be on the 25th of November, and that will be in solidarity with our sisters of the Kurdish community. And I hope you all know about the very successful feminist anti-fascist action that took place last month when we stopped the fascists on the street, and we're going to do it again. So get involved.
Cheers,
Any other
Sherry.
plugs?
Hey, it's open mic.
So,
yeah, so it's not an Antiuniversity plug, but I don't know if many people saw the kind of awful video last week from the Grenfell Tires, the effigy around Guy Fawkes.
Yeah.
Does anyone see this? So every 14th there's a silent walk that goes around Grenfell. It'll be tomorrow actually, 6:45 at Notting Hill Methodist Church. 6:45 there'll be just a walk in remembrance. It's silent. There's a lot of people there from Grenfell. It's a really nice kind of emotional space, and there's really lovely people there. So that's my plan.
Okay, I'm going to give one too.
Yes. Everybody wants to go.
that is proper Anthea.
Hi everyone.
Yes.
I'm a member of the London Renters Union. I don't know if any of you heard of it.
Yes.
So the building next door, some of the traders were being evicted. We've halted the evictions with support of other local kind of people, activists, but the future of that building is still kind of up in the air, so it would be really great if everyone can sort of look at our social media, London Renters Union. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and just keep an eye out for updates. And if you want to join us, but there will definitely be things going on in terms of protecting the traders that are trading in the building next door. Thank you.
Yay.
Yeah, yes.
Anyone else? More plugs?
Anyone want a pizza? We make pizza here.
Thank you.
Cheers.